All right, back live tonight here on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. The Black Business Council says some non-governmental organizations are interfering with the processes of procurement, or at least the Public Procurement Bill. In a report by Sunday World, BBC President Elias Monage accused NGOs of sabotaging black businesses and resisting transformation. Monage joins us now in studio for more on that. Very strong words. Good evening. Good to have you.
Evening, Tabo and the listeners at home.
Sabotage is a very strong word. Eh?
Yeah, quite right. It is.
So how would you come to a conclusion that especially NGOs are sabotaging black businesses?
Let's look at the context, because the context is very important in any given situation. Firstly, there are pockets of incidences that are happening in our country on the economic front, where you see in the gas, for example, the gas economy, there were black companies that for the first time in the history of the gas industry, they managed then to secure a participation, inclusiveness in that subsector or sector of the economy, which is gas. They were part of the car powership. And for many years, I think for more than 3 years, they were dragged in litigation, they were dragged in various processes because, again, for the first time, you then have black consortiums that they're not going to participate in the mainstream economy. Yeah. Then who dragged them? And who opposed this thing? A number of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that in the main, they are funded by big businesses. That's the one thing. The second part that we have seen is around various pieces of legislation. In mining, we've seen where a number of organizations, they've opposed the question of empowerment. And they basically said, if, Tabo, you're part of a consortium that acquired equity in mining houses, and you exit,
once empowered, always
empowered. That entity continues then to be empowered. And you then ask yourself, if you are married and you divorce, you are not married. Now, on what basis do we then argue for once empowered, always empowered? It then means in society, if a person was married, that person continued to be married. But we should not then define that person as a divorcee. And I'm saying that is the same thing that I'm drawing inferences. Yeah. The third part that, again, we've seen non-governmental organizations at the back of procurement bill that is before Parliament. Number of them, you then ask yourself, why are they now part of this procurement thing, the procurement bill? Because are they in procurement? Are they in manufacturing? Are they rendering a service? Where state will then procure things from them? The answer is no, because they are then the proxy of big businesses that are opposing the rationale around a transformatory agenda. Yeah. The fourth part, you then have a situation where some of these organizations, you then ask yourself, what is the mandate? I mean, you look at, for example, Corruption Watch. The mandate in my little corner, they deal with corruption. Yes. So, do they have anything to do with procurement? The answer is no. Yeah. Well, let me give you one last thing. You then have another organization called Amaban, where they're supposed then to deal with they are so-called investigative journalists. Yes. What do? They are also then presenting a paper in Parliament. They're making submissions together with South African race relations that procurement is costly and all other issues. And when you then drill down to these issues, is around what they call it a different. And it then means they're then looking at this thing at the back of being used as a proxy. Let alone, a few months ago, the same organization, they were basically looking at, the Moti Group. And Moti Group, they don't do any business with government in whatever form or shape. And whereas they were then supposed, the same organization, they had a chairperson who was involved in a sexual scandal. The same organization that they are investigative journalists. They cannot investigate their own house in order. They are then looking at somebody else. And I'm saying you then take a step back to say, now let's talk about a procurement.
Yeah.
Now, do they have a business in procurement? The answer is no. Corruption-wise, do they have a business in this thing?
Talk about
the answer is no.
Let's look at that. I mean, they are not claiming to have business in procurement, but they are saying that we need safeguards. We need a single framework to regulate public procurement. Why? Because the Constitutional Court says that there is a constitutional element to procurement when it begins to impact on service delivery. So we saw how corruption in procurement would impact on the delivery of services to communities. And so they are saying the current procurement bill would have, as it sits now, us facing state capture 2.0 because it doesn't have adequate safeguards in it that deal with corruption.
No, that's not true. That's not what they're saying. I mean, for example, there are a number of facets that we need them to deal with. Firstly, any state procurement must deal with the redress of the economic exclusivity of the historically disadvantaged people.
Yeah.
The current bill as it stands now is silent on the redress. That's the first thing. Secondly, the same organization, none of them, they're talking about the redress. They're basically saying we need them to look at the cost of procurement. So which basically then means if you then get an imported a product or service from somewhere else is cheaper, you need them to go on that because they talk about value for money.
Yeah.
Value for money is not talking about equitable. They're not talking about the redress. It's not talking about any empowerment in any form or shape. And fourthly, they're not saying we need them to find a way to deal with empowerment in various categories where, for example, we then talk about whether it's 40% or 50% set aside for black women, for people living with disability, the youth, and various other categories. They are silent on those issues. And you cannot then hide on the basis of value for money. And hence we're then saying, number of this organization, they are proxy for white businesses, that they're anti-transformatory agenda. That's the point that we have raised.
So they are saying, one, which I suppose you do not disagree with, that the bill needs to, one, meet this objective, prevent fronting. Two, promote fairness. Three, promote access to information to the public. So it should be transparent. It should, well, I suppose you've spoken about the cost and value for money, which is efficiency. And they're saying currently those objectives are not being met by this bill.
Again, let's take a step back. Because, history is something that you must learn from it and draw lessons and forge ahead. The state capture have mentioned a number of big companies that were caught up in corruption. All those companies that are still doing business with state. None of this organization, they've raised one comment or any statement to that effect. They continue doing business. Some of them, they've even paid billions back to ESCOM, but they're still doing business. If it was Thabo or anyone else, you'd be on the front page.
Some of them are protected by the private sector.
There's
nothing wrong. They can go back and
not really. I'm saying the same.
We asked the question and we said, but is this not the same company?
I'm saying to you, the same organization that they talk about transparency, they're silent on these issues. They're not going public to say this big organization, they're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, because they're funded by them. Now, who funded a clandestine operation at ESCOM? The same big businesses.
Yes.
Okay? Did they write anything on them? The answer is no. Now, let's come back to the elephant in the room. The purpose of Public Procurement Bill is to deal with a centralized framework where state must basically procure services and products to various categories of people.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need a legislation, a primary legislation that stipulates how state organs, government departments, SOEs must then procure in terms of giving them a framework.
Yeah.
And therefore, Treasury becomes a custodian of procurement because they control and run money on behalf of government. And I'm saying none of these organizations, they're not saying this is how we need them to look at a particular framework of category of historically disadvantaged people. They're basically saying, forget about this thing, we need them to talk about value for money.
So when they're talking about fragmented public procurement, what are they talking about?
Fragmentation, it implies, it's a simple English word. Fragmentation basically means you don't have a centralized. You have that municipality doing their own things, SOEs doing their own things. That's fragmentation.
Yeah. So you agree with them?
No, we don't. No, we don't.
We need to get rid of that fragmentation and have a centralized.
We need them to have a centralized process in terms of the Act. The Act, as a primary, must basically then stipulate how state must then procure. That's centralization.
Yeah.
And then
does the bill not say that? Because their argument is that the bill in its current form, it doesn't say that explicitly.
No, I'm saying we have argued at the Black Business Council that the current bill as it stands, it must basically entrench, one, a centralization of our procurement system. Two, the implementation takes place at different levels, provincial, regional, and local level. And even at the departmental and state-owned entities, that's how the implementation takes place. But the framework must be centralized. That's the point that we have argued.
Right.
And then the second part of our argument that we put forward is that if we then look at that centralization, the Act itself as a primary Act for procurement must then stipulate localization, designation, and various categories of people, whether we then talk about the youth, unemployed, and people living with disabilities, women-owned businesses. You then have that clearly being defined in our primary act so that you don't then rely on a framework in the absence of the primary act outlining those issues.
The Black Business Council says some non-governmental organizations are interfering with the transformation. In fact, interfering with black businesses in the country. Still with us, BBC President Elias Monage. And we wanted to talk about, okay, we've touched on the one aspect which they are raising. The other aspect which I'm sure you have a view on, the automatic exclusion of public office bearers and politicians in the bidding process. It seems it's not included in this procurement bill.
You know, I don't want to argue on definitions. I want to talk about the content. If you are employed in any government institutions, automatically that will then bar you in the participation of the procurement process, because you cannot be a player and the referee at the same time. So you are employed by state, and therefore you are not going to do business with state. Government, they were clear. I don't represent government, but I'm saying in our understanding is that those categories of people that are employed and they work for state, they're not going to do any business in any form or shape with this thing. We don't need a provision of the bill then to talk about that because it's an automatic exclusion. The second thing, in business, we have a thing called conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And we can don't talk about different types of conflict. There is a perceived and other forms of conflict. And therefore, you cannot then be involved. If you are working for state, then you participate in any procurement in whatever form or shape. Now, the other part that they're not addressing, number of these NGOs, they have a clear, well-thought plan and strategy. Some, they will basically attack the procurement bill. They will take government to courts because they're funded by private businesses. Some, they will basically then look at the tax laws, and then they will also then take government to court. Some, they will also then look at the implementation or applications of transformation in different sectors. Yeah. In mining, we've seen that once empowered, always empowered. In tourism, we've seen that. And in procurement, we've seen a number of other organizations that have challenged this thing. The matter went to court and all these things. Now, you then sit back and then you take a deep reflection to say, wow, this is a well-orchestrated, well-planned strategy by white business plus non-governmental organization, because they've created and funded this organization. Why are they not disclosing who's funding them? both sides. White business must basically disclose which organization are they funding as non-governmental organization, and two, those NGOs also, they must then either stick to their mandate, and two, disclose who's funding them, so that at least we know, because it's part of conflict, because they are fighting proxy battles or proxy wars on behalf of other people. Now, if somebody's saying, I'm responsible, and we're not opposing anyone to investigate corruption, whatever, we support that wholeheartedly. But you cannot tomorrow, you are no longer in corruption, you are somewhere else, you are opposing some piece of legislation for people going to church, or somebody who wants to procure certain things, or then saying, no, we are not even talking about preventing corruption, but we are then at the forefront to say you cannot then transform, because if you transform, transformation is equals to corruption. And we are saying that's not true, that's not correct. We have seen this thing also in the environmental space, where people are then saying coal is equal to corruption. To corruption, yeah. Coal. Okay. We are then saying it then means me and you, Thabo, we grew up before democracy, and we didn't have electricity. Yes, we grew up using candles and coal. Yeah. What corruption are we then talking about? Yeah. Now, it's because those people, they are pushing a particular narrative out there in the public gallery, that we need them to shut down coal and then revert to solar and wind. And no nation have industrialized using coal, using solar, no wind, because you need them to rely on the base load, which is nuclear, gas, and coal power stations. And I'm saying, in the main, that's the point that you are raising.
So when you go to, of course, that's the substance. That's the content, as you put it, yes, of the issues and how they begin to affect you on the ground. But if we strictly stick to the bill and what the bill says, they are raising an issue that we need to move procurement to a technology-based system where, of course, it's transparent, everybody can see it, the public can have access to it, but also we need to then codify the details of this procurement system, which currently are being left to interpretation.
Nobody is opposing technology. I mean, technology is here to stay, and we are not going to go back and use, even in computers, we're not using Pentium 1. Yeah. We are moving with times in terms of the evolution of technology. And how we then finally have a system for procurement is something that we need them to define it. Because transparency, it means a number of things. You cannot then argue transparency, but you hide who's funding you. Equally so, if we then talk about e-commerce, e-procurement, it then means we need them to have a system, and then we define that system, how things are going to be done in terms of capturing the registration and how adjudication will then be done, including various other things. For example, you need also then to set guidelines and criteria to say, if we're then to do adjudication, do you then look at empowerment, do you look at various components of empowerment in whatever form or shape, so that, again, designation, various categories for both professionals and business people, that then included into this thing.
Yeah. Here's one area which I think you're probably going to be debating for a while with them, and back and forth, even saying if it goes currently as it is, it's going to end up in court. But this is the area around preferential commitment for transformation. They're saying this is left to interpretation.
I guess they must go back and read our submission. Our submission, we're not saying we need to leave preferential categories to be open-ended. We're saying we must define it. The Act must define it. I'm saying this bill, eventually when it becomes an Act, it must then define various categories of preferential. If we're then saying 40 or 50% women-owned, the Act must basically state categorically. When you then look at this thing, you look at companies that are women-owned, they need them to be given set aside. You then need them to look at a preference given to the youth. People living with disabilities, it must be specified in the final act of Parliament on procurement, so that you don't leave this thing to interpretation down the road. And that's where, I guess, we don't agree with them. We're basically saying the act must stipulate and clarify those things upfront, so that the people that they execute this thing, they should not then have any interpretation in any form or shape.
Elias Monage, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming in, clearing some of these issues. That is BBC President Elias Monage there, accusing NGOs of sabotaging black businesses, and he's articulated some of those issues that have got them concerned.